I don't have a man's voice, but I have a male interpreter speaking for me. I have two of them, a male and a female interpreter who will be taking turns in 20-minute increments. So don't think that my voice is changing drastically. Okay. So I am deaf, and I'm also a graduate student at Arizona State University, studying as a social worker. I'm also a graduate intern with Sonora UCED school. And I've been married for 21 years now, and I'm a mother of 4 children. 2 are young adults and 2 are in high school. And I wanted to explain my background, a brief explanation of my background. I wasn't born deaf. I'm a first child of my parents. And my mom said that I was happy and outgoing and observant, goofy. I was a smart baby. By the time I was 1 year old, I could speak 50 words. Most children at that age can speak maybe 1 to 2 words at 15 months. But so my vocabulary was pretty advanced. But at the time I turned 15 months, I got sick, and my parents thought it was my first experience with the flu, but it kept getting worse. I was screaming in pain every time my diapers were changed because they would lift my legs, and I had a fever of 105 degrees. Doctors decided to do a spinal tap, and I was then diagnosed with spinal bifida, or actually, sorry, spinal meningitis. And I was in the hospital for 11 days. Doctors then thought I was fine and discharged me, but my personality had changed. I had become more withdrawn and quiet, shy, reserved. And my parents had noticed this. One day when I woke up from a nap, my father went into my room, and I didn't see him come in. My back was to the door. Most of the time when I hear the door, I would look to the door, but I didn't hear it. And my dad had his own suspicions, so he decided to do a test, and he called out my name. He said, "Amber," and there was no response. He tried a few more times, each time a bit louder, and still no response. At that moment, my dad knew that I had become deaf. So I was diagnosed with profound deafness. And of course, my parents were heartbroken. We were already developing a relationship through communication and language. And they're thinking, she's profoundly deaf, so it's going to be impossible to acquire language through auditory means. So they decided to go ahead and learn sign language, even though many people were saying to not do that. I asked my parents, why did you go ahead and learn sign language, even though you were encouraged not to? And they said, well, if my child needs glasses, I would get them glasses to help them see better. Well, it's the same idea. So I started preschool when I was 2 years old, and not long after that, not long after I became deaf. And I had people there who were deaf and people who could sign their staff. And so I had a very language-rich environment that I grew up in. And my teachers took night classes, actually taught night classes to my parents in order for them to learn sign language and to communicate with me. So my school experience growing up, I graduated with honors in high school. I was involved in all kinds of different sports, graduated with a BA in family human development in college. And so as I became older, I started to notice that certain observations about my deaf peers. And I noticed that they didn't have the same experience that I had. Many of them would say, your family can sign? And, I have 3 younger siblings. 2 are of my sisters. I have 2 sisters and 1 younger brother, all born into a home that was already using sign language. Both of my sisters are also sign language interpreters. My husband is a sign language interpreter, so he's fluent in ASL. My children's first language is American Sign Language, so their primary language is ASL and English. So I've always been surrounded by family that use sign language that I can communicate with fluently. When my kids started to go to school full time, I got a part-time job as a teacher's aide at the high school, the school for the deaf there. And same pattern as my deaf peers would tell me. Everyone was so surprised that my family could sign. And so I wondered why my experience was different than the others. And over the years, I've identified the common denominator is language acquisition. Their experience is predicated on their early language acquisition or lack of spoken language or sign languages. At the same time, I had another part-time job that I worked at as a deaf mentor for Arizona School for the Deaf and Blind. I worked with families that have deaf babies and toddlers. And during that time, I also identified some gaps in the early intervention system. And that was a time when I was working with the deaf mentor program. I noticed that many of these children who were getting the intervention started about 2.5 years old, but they're missing a huge part of their language acquisition time period. And those services are only available to families whose children are under 3. So they're missing a lot of time. So from 3 to 5 years old, those families have little to no support before kindergarten. So when I started looking into this and doing research on language in regards to deaf people, the literature started to show that there is data and evidence that support my personal observations from peer-reviewed articles. And there is science that validates my parents' decision to use all resources available as early as possible, including sign language. That experience led me to where I am today, as I work to earn my MSW. Hopefully, I can work in various capacities in the deaf community, advocating for language rights, equality for deaf children, spreading awareness about language development in deaf children, and educating those within children in the deaf ecosystem about language acquisition and the importance of language acquisition at an early age. So here I am, beginning my journey by presenting information on this very topic. Thank you to Dr. James and Dr. Tomasa. Next slide, please. So the objectives for my presentation today is to first recognize the importance of language and to gain insight about language acquisition and accessibility, and to develop knowledge of language deprivation, to learn about the effects of language deprivation, and finally, to share recommendations to prevent language deprivation. Next slide, please. So what is deafness? So first, I want to operationalize the concept of deafness to make sure that we all have a common understanding of what it means to be deaf. Simple definition is the lack of ability to hear. It's important to understand that deaf people can do anything except hear. Also, there is a spectrum of deafness. For example, there's mild, moderate, severe, and profound deafness. So I want to do a poll question, and let's see what you think about this question. How do you think most deaf people prefer to be identified as? What do you think? Ready? All right, it's the third option. Most deaf people prefer to be identified as deaf or hard of hearing. Good job. Most of you got it right. Most people mean well. They want to be politically correct. And I want to briefly explain why the term deaf is the preferred term to be used. And also, when I use the term deaf during this presentation, I mean people whose deafness is across the spectrum, okay? The term hearing impaired implies in some way that we are impaired. So we don't refer ourselves that way. We're only impaired by society and their view of us. Hearing loss is technically not always conceptually accurate. Some people are born deaf, so they've never lost anything to begin with. But there are some people who do become deaf later in life, like me. But the term loss, though, has a negative connotation to it. So when we become deaf or are born deaf, we are automatically a member of the deaf community. We become members of the deaf community no matter where we go. And the culture celebrates sign language and the language and the fact that we have effective communication. And we have a unique way of seeing the world through different lenses. And so we're able to develop healthy sense of identity. And we consider those things all together as what we call deaf gain. The word deaf, the term deaf is not a four-letter word. It's a wonderful word that we embrace. Next slide. I want to share some general statistics about deafness. First, the World Health Organization, WHO, reports that in this world, there are over 1.5 billion people that experience non-typical hearing levels. The WHO also predicts that number will increase to over 2.5 billion by the year 2030. And I want to break down some of these numbers. Did you know that 2 to 3 out of 1,000 children are born deaf? And 95% of deaf children lack exposure to language early in life. And about 95% of the children who are born to hearing parents don't have access to communication using sign language early on in life. And less than 8% of deaf children receive regular access to sign language. Next slide, please. After parents find out that their child is deaf, they tend to meet with various professionals from different disciplines, such as audiologists, ENTs, speech therapists, teachers, and what have you. And oftentimes, they encourage their parents to focus primarily on the ability to listen and to speak. They prescribe various auditory devices, such as hearing aids, BAHAs, cochlear implants, And they discourage using sign language and only encourage sign language as a last resort. There's nothing wrong with focusing on speech and hearing development, but it's important to understand that there's no guarantee that there will be optimal speech and hearing outcomes. The results themselves are highly variable, and every deaf child is different. Some have more success than others. Professionals typically share a common belief that sign language interferes with speech development and language development, even though current literature proves that sign language, children who learn sign language with or without auditory devices have more success with speech and language development, along with scoring higher in intelligence scores than deaf children who don't sign. Auditory devices, using them alone is not an effective approach to acquire language. It's not an optimal approach. Why do professionals discourage the use of sign language? Researchers have concluded the professionals' resistance towards sign language comes from a prejudice against sign language and against deafness. So it's important to note there's no empirical evidence that shows that sign language is harmful to children's ability to speak or to develop language. Next slide, please. I want to consider the importance of language and how it's very important in our lives, everyday lives. Next slide. We as humans have an innate desire to belong. Language is linked to communication skills, and communication is a key for developing relationships and experiencing intimate relationships. It brings us a sense of belonging. Next slide, please. Helen Keller is a well-known deaf-blind person. She explained the limitations she experienced and that many other deaf individuals experience. And she explains that blindness separates people from things, deafness separates people from people. So it's a very huge impact, has a very big impact on our well-being and our sense of being a whole person. Having a disability, it's a deafness as a disability is different than other disabilities because it's more of a social disability than a physical disability. Other disabilities also inhibit communications as well, such as intellectual disabilities and such. But deaf people have an effective communication method that is effective and native to American Sign Language and deaf users because it is visually based and natural for sign language users. And we're going to switch interpreters one moment.
Okay, next slide, please. Not only is language necessary as an experience to feel like these individuals belong, but also it affects our quality of life. Language is necessary, for example, for academic purposes. Language supports health and social emotional health. It also is necessary to have proper mental health and intellectual health. And all of these things affect the quality of life in general. And this is all a basic human right. Next slide, please. So now how does language have a role in brain development? especially during those early years. I'm going to explain some of these basic and really important facts related to early brain development. First, neuroplasticity is huge. During those first few years of life, it's a big part of development. Your brain is like a sponge and it gathers a lot of information during those first few years, more than any time in your life. The second part of it is the first 5 years of your life are considered to be a critical period of language development. And also the best time to learn most language is during those 5 years. It's important to note that there's no discrimination between language modalities. Your brain does not discriminate as long as it's getting language. So it's the prime time for multilanguage acquisition is during those times to acquire language. So since the brain is already primed and ready to learn language during those times in the earliest years, let's discuss a little bit how language acquisition happens during that time. Next slide, please. So how do humans acquire language? How does that happen exactly? Next slide. So for those with typical hearing levels, language itself is just native. It's because it's just naturally occurring in the environment. There's an ongoing exposure to whatever people are talking about, whether it's directed to the individual themselves or they hear incidental conversations going on around them. Also, it's acquired through visual, auditory abilities. There's also, it requires almost little to no effort because language is 100% accessible during that time. So now that we have a basic understanding of the role that language plays in our lives, how do hearing people acquire language? Let's talk a little bit about what the role is and how it affects people who are deaf and how it affects their lives. Next slide, please. So I kind of want to do a visual activity. I want to kind of put you in the perspective of what a deaf person might feel like learning how to speak. So I want you to imagine that you're in a soundproof room, like an auditory or an audiologist booth. It's typically a soundproof room that's closed in and you can't hear anything on the outside. And imagine you're trying to learn a foreign language like French or German or Russian or something like that. But the person is only through a window that you can see. And you're having to read lips, you can't hear anything. And you're learning a new language, trying to read lips, trying to figure out what language they're speaking and how to learn it yourself. How would that work? Let me start with let's do the next poll. Okay, so deaf people can lip read with how much percent accuracy? 85 to 95%, 70 to 80%, or 30 to 40% accuracy? Which do you think is the correct answer? Okay, so are we taking it? All right, let's see how we did. Okay, great. Next slide. So, seems like most of you know your stuff. So around only 30 to 40% of speech is visible. So I want to do a quick lip reading example for all of you. If you can watch my mouth. Do you think that I said, "Where's my mom?" Or "Where's my pop, my soda pop?" or where's my mop? Those words all look the same. I have a quick story that I want to share. And this is from a friend, a hard of hearing woman who grew up using the oral approach. And that's an approach where you typically rely on speech and hearing for communication instead of sign language. So this hard of hearing woman was calling her mom, and her mom said, or she said, "Mom, what's the recipe for the hospice recipe?" And she said, "What is that? I don't know what that is." She said, "You make it all the time when I was growing up." And she said, "The hospice, the hospice?" And she finally figured out, "Oh, you're talking about the ice box cake." She said, "Is that what it's called? Not the hospice cake?" Because if you're looking at my mouth, icebox and hospice look very similar. They look very, very similar. So that was one example of that. Another thing to think about with lip reading is that everyone moves their mouths very differently. Some people talk with their teeth, their mouths open a little more. Some people have very little to no movement of their lips, like this. Some people speak very quickly. Some people have lisps or accents or just all kinds of variants. So with lip reading, the mouth must be visible at all times. Obviously, for example, a deaf student in a schoolroom, if the teacher is writing on the board and has their back turned to the students, they cannot read lips. Or if the teacher is walking up and down the aisles during class speaking, you do not have access to see lips or lip reading. Or maybe another student is making a comment or a question in the class. You have to look around and find who's speaking and try your best to see what they're saying, and you obviously might miss it or not be able to see. And that ends up in missing a lot of information. And that's not even to mention the disaster of COVID with the masks. That's, kind of enough said. So there are many, many of these experiences with deaf people trying to access language. So now to give you a little peek into what language acquisition looks like in an auditory versus visual way. Next slide here. I want to use a quick simulation. It's called a foundation. There's a foundation that has provided us with a simulation that you can kind of experience what it feels to have this kind of hearing loss. If you want to go ahead and do the simulation.
Hi, Hadley. How's it going?
Good, Grandpa.
What'd you do in school today?
Well, one main thing was that media got canceled, so our class got to either write or draw something.
And what did you write or draw?
Well, I wrote something, and I call it the random fact of the day. Would you like to hear it?
I'd love to.
Random fact of the day. Did you know that if you dug a hole from one side of the earth to the other and you jump...
The normal one. If you go to the next one, go to the mild level. So for those who are deaf,
Hi, Hadley. How's it going?
Good, Grandpa.
Shows you
What'd you do
the
in
amount of
school
hearing
today?
loss.
Well, one main thing was that media got canceled, so our class got to either write or draw something.
And what did you write or draw?
Well, I wrote something, and I call it the random fact of the day. Would you like to hear it?
I'd love to.
Random fact of the day. Did you know that if you dug a hole from one side of the earth to the other and you jumped through it, you would go to the other side immediately? It would only take you 12 minutes. The cool thing is that when you jump in the hole, you can't get out of it because the gravity would pull you back. This process would repeat until you die.
Oh, that's terrible.
What?
Okay. So then the next one will be the moderate version of hearing loss.
What'd you do in school today?
And this will show more of what a deaf person who only can hear about 50%.
Got to either write or draw something.
And what did you write or draw?
Well, I wrote something.
It's very unclear.
Of the day. Would you like to?
So then you can go to now the severe. Okay. So the point of this, thank you so much for doing that for me. So the point of this is an estimate, basically, of how much language a person has access to. And basically the sort of the amount of information, as if any. So for example, a deaf person might have 40%, ability to have access to language. If a deaf person has 80% of hearing, then they can access 80% of language, right? So that's obvious that if a deaf person has no hearing, 0% access to language, it's 0% access. So that experience is something that people go through all day long, and it can be really, really taxing. Imagine trying to learn in school any subjects with trying to listen with whatever residual hearing or limited hearing you have while trying to lip read. It can be very, very taxing, and that results in something that we call listening fatigue. It can be something that completely wears you out as you day to day emotionally and intellectually are trying to make up for the information that you are not privy to. So a better idea for a deaf person with a language experience is a more common situation for many people is, for example, what we call the dinner situation. So if you go to the next slide. So we call it dinner table syndrome. I'm going to refer to it as DTS. And there's research that's been studied about with deaf children showing that it describes that all deaf children experience some sort of this kind of indirect family communication, and they're not privy to that through their auditory abilities or their lack of. So again, at the dinner table, typically there's a rich learning environment. For deaf children, what does that mean? It means any indirect communication is lost. Any contextual learning, or what we call incidental learning, opportunities are lost. So for example, myself as a deaf mentor, I work with one family. They had 3 kids, and the middle boy was deaf. And his older brother did something they shouldn't have done. So his parents verbally disciplined him for what he did wrong. And as you can imagine, the deaf boy's kind of watching at what's going on, but doesn't have any information because it's visual. And when I saw that, I kind of reflected on my own life and experience. And I realized as I was growing up, I thought I was the only one getting in trouble. And I would say to Mom, I'm the only one getting in trouble. Why am I always getting in trouble? And my mom said, no, you just don't hear your other siblings getting in trouble. And I realized my mom meant well, of course, my parents meant well. They were doing the best they could, with busy kids. And it's not necessarily my business to see them getting in trouble. But again, hearing kids often hear what's going on behind the scenes, and they're hearing incidental conversations and discipline and things like that, which deaf children do not typically have or experience. So when I mentored that family, I said, I see this situation where you're disciplining your older children, and maybe you don't want your other kids to know what's going on, but it's maybe a really great opportunity for your deaf child to see what's going on and understand what's happening. Because I only felt like I was the only one getting in trouble, I had this negative self-view that I was just a troublemaker and that I was more of a problem than anybody else. And I wasn't explained until later what was going on. And I had a different worldview because of that. People also underestimate deaf children's level of cognition. and the amount of information that they have access to comparatively. Deaf children are very famous for just nodding their heads and saying they understand when they don't understand, because they're exhausted at trying to follow everything and say, can you say that again? Or so they just kind of fake it and pretend like they're understanding. And I'm willing to admit I do the same thing, but I've often been busted when I'm smiling and just nodding and somebody says, I asked you a question. And I was like, whoops. So it's really important to not assume that it's as clear as it is, as you think it is. I also have a friend who I went to school with, and she told me growing up, she was from a big family, about 9 kids in the family, and she's deaf. And every day her parents would say, okay, let's everybody get in the Suburban, the big family car, family vehicle. So all the kids would file on into the car, the family car, but they would say, come on, get into the family Suburban. And then when she was about 17, it just so happened that she was the only one, and she was going to go somewhere with her parents, and her dad said, okay, go get into the Suburban. And she said, what's a Suburban? I don't know what that is. And her father said, you don't know what a Suburban is? And her dad at that time realized, oh, wow, she's just following her siblings, what they're doing, but she's missing some of that incidental knowledge, that word Suburban, what that meant, that she just didn't have access to. And at 17, she finally realized what that was. And her father realized, or her parents realized, how much she'd been missing over the years. Also, the dinner table is an important place to learn about health even. So for example, parents might be talking about, oh yeah, grandpa had a heart attack because heart disease is something that is passed down in our family. We have a history of that. It's part of your genetics and your family experiences, and those things come up. Maybe at the dinner table, you also talk about food, what's healthy and what's not. And you develop health-related terms as those are being explained to you. Or, even the doctors, sometimes when they're having a physical. Often deaf people don't have access to that information, and so they struggle when they have a health issue to be able to explain what's going on with their own bodies, because they don't have the language to explain their own situations, and they don't even understand their own health related to how to use the vocabulary involved. This is it's also like the 30 million word gap. It becomes a cumulative effect of language gaps and language deprivation, and it can really, really add up over a lifetime. We'll go ahead and switch interpreters.
Next slide, please. So those word gaps are the same as language gaps. So that brings up a question. What will happen if we have little to no language at all? Next slide, please. The cumulative experience of having lack of access to language is a situation known as language deprivation. And so this is a standard definition in the current literature. And the quote here says, it occurs due to a chronic lack of full access to a natural language during the critical period of language acquisition, approximately the first 5 years of a child's life. And now I've got a thought I want to share with you, but first I've got one more poll for you all. So what do the 5 names on the screen have in common? Are they the 5 easiest names to understand through lip reading? Are they the 5 names of the only documented cases of language deprivation in hearing children? Or the names of the first 5 deaf children to acquire language using ASL. Ready? Let's see how you did. Okay, it's kind of a tricky question. New information from me as well. So, it means that those are the 5 names of the only documented cases of language deprivation in hearing children. Language deprivation is a very rare phenomenon in those with typical hearing levels, because as we just talked about, language is always going on. It's there. It begins at birth and even before birth. Studies have done experiments on withholding language from humans is unethical, really. That's why there's only a very few studies available on language deprivation in hearing children. Those experiments are known as forbidden experiments. Dr. Sanjay Gulati is a deaf psychologist at Boston University. And he shares, I'm going to share a little bit of information from one of his presentations regarding language deprivation in those children. He points out that these are the only documented cases of language deprivation that has happened over 200 to 300 years. But still, I see about 5 cases of language deprivation in my office every day. So that's pretty powerful, right? So that brings up a question. Why is it okay to withhold access and natural language to deaf children, their natural language? Next slide, please. Earlier, I mentioned that language is a basic human right. So now in the context of language deprivation with little to no language stimulation during the early years, the experience is negative biopsychosocial results, poor academic outcomes, limited education, and that leads to job opportunities, hard to find work to support themselves or their families later on in life, poor social skills, behavioral issues. It limits their abilities to build healthy relationships, and poor health, understanding health, their own health and those issues, healthcare, and other related information. And that leads then to poor quality of life. Many deaf people are deprived, really ultimately are deprived of their basic human right to language acquisition. Next slide. Now I want to talk about the neurological effects of language deprivation. Functional MRIs, which are called fMRIs, have shown that language acquisition or deprivation causes neurological changes in the structure and functioning of the brain. The anatomical effects are incomplete neurodevelopment and a reduced amount of gray matter and brain structure differences in adults. And it depends on the time and the quality of the access to language during their childhood years. And for the functional side, that means intellectual disability, and it causes language disfluency. That means when a person, their best language is not considered fluent. They are learning, they're learning just words, but they're not fluent with the words, the language, and they struggle to learn academic concepts And that's indeed a form of brain damage. So the effects of this language deprivation are not reversible, but they're preventable through consistent exposure to accessible language. Next slide, please. Since the effects of language deprivation is supported by evidence-based studies, research has concluded what is said here in this quote: precisely because the critical period exists, the highest priority must be to provide a DHH child whatever type of linguistic input is most accessible and most likely to result in age-appropriate language mastery rather than a philosophical modality preference. So for optimal language development, allow deaf children to have access to sign language ASAP. The critical period is time sensitive and only happens once in a lifetime. Research shows that if a deaf child doesn't master language by the age 5, then they'll never achieve language fluency, spoken or in sign language. Next slide, please. So I know that maybe some of you have a personal experience or professional experience working with deaf children. So I want to clarify, I don't want to make you feel bad or anything. I want you to know that it's important that oftentimes withholding language from deaf children is not intentional. Most likely it's due to misinformation, not being aware of the current literature, and also not acknowledging the personal or implicit bias views regarding sign language and deafness. And I honestly believe that parents do the best with what they know. And as Maya Angelou says so eloquently, do the best until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So let's talk about next steps to prevent and minimize the effects of language deprivation. Next slide, please. The most common recommendation from my literature review regarding language deprivation is support sign language to effectively foster healthy and age-appropriate language development in deaf children. Studies also share more specific recommendations for each group: parents, professionals, and researchers. And we'll discuss that next. Next slide. Recommendations for parents. Here are some of the most common recommendations. Instead of focusing on speech and listening skills, include and set goals to promote language development. Remember, there is increasing evidence that sign language in deaf children leads to better speech and listening outcomes than non-signing children. Reach out to deaf adults who have lived experience as a deaf person. They are the true experts on deafness. They were also deaf children at one time as well. So they are today's deaf children's future voice, if you will. Some states do have a deaf mentoring program, like I mentioned. Arizona has one. You might reach out to them and start services. Also look for professionals that support language development in deaf children. Next slide, please. Recommendations for allied professionals. Need to present evidence-based and unbiased information as opportunities rather than options. Don't make parents feel like they have to make a choice. Encourage them to try everything, and as soon as possible, like my parents did. And endorse sign language and monitor language development. Also, it's important to think critically about conclusions made in research studies. Look at the studies, the design, the sampling methods, the sample variables, and the like. Next slide, please. And some recommendations for researchers. As I mentioned, for professionals, you need to encourage recognize the research of the research. They do quasi experiments and correlation studies. Those don't use randomization. That means their samples are intentional and they're limited. The reliability and the validity of the studies are limited. Other recommendations are develop instruments to accurately measure sign language proficiency. Inaccurate types of instruments can contribute to misinformation about sign language proficiency and also perpetuate further stigmatization regarding sign language. Also, analyze successful language development regardless of modality. Next slide, please. So the overall arching message that I've learned from my research is to maximize resources, maximize potential, limit resources, limit potential. All children have an innate natural desire to make their parents, their teachers, and various ones proud by doing their best. So if you give them everything they need, they will show you what works for them, and they will use their natural abilities to navigate their world, the hearing world. Next slide, please. And I want to thank you all for your time and for learning about one of the most important issues in the deaf community. And what I've shared with you today is only scratching the surface. I could go on and on this topic. I hope that it inspired you to learn more about our community. Next slide, please. And this is a wonderful resource. What I just shared with you includes this video. Here's a 2-minute video that sort of encapsulates a lot of what I've talked about. If you want to watch this on your own time, I recommend it. It's on YouTube. Next slide. I have given a survey. I'd really appreciate your honesty, your honest feedback, suggestions, and ways that I can improve the presentation. And there's a QR code to access the survey. And with the remaining time, there's not much left, about 4 minutes. I'd like to entertain any questions you may have.
Would you mind putting the QR code back up again? Somebody requested that. Thank you. Feel free to email me if you have any questions as well. Okay, so there's a link to the survey as well in the chat box now. Thank you all for your kind words. I really appreciate it. Thank you.